I just start by saying, expressing my gratitude for the invitation to take part today. I have to say, when Darren wrote to me, I eagerly accepted, mainly because this is a chance for me to learn more from you about the current debate on federalism in Tamil Nadu. But I agreed to offer a few reflections as well. I do so not from any firm political standpoint of my own, but as someone who has observed and written about Indian federalism quite substantially for over a decade now. So I'll just offer a few remarks here. I don't have anything like the polished speeches that the previous speakers have offered. But I thought I might just start by addressing the title of the event, which I think offers a kind of provocation, which is worth musing on a bit more, which is the idea that federalism and nationalism are somehow in opposition. And obviously we've heard from other speakers that the current juncture and the pursuit of what are more clearly articulated one nation aspirations in all sorts of different realms of policy making, that this shift towards one nation ideology obviously poses a challenge to the practice and idea of federalism as it had previously existed in some periods of India's post-colonial history, but we should acknowledge that the practice of federalism has looked quite different, and the practice of state autonomy has been quite different across that period too. But I think just coming back to the idea that there's an essential tension between federalism and nationalism, I think it's useful actually to interrogate that assumption, because in many ways, federalism is an idea is both an idea and a way of structuring political institutions that can embrace or accommodate nationalism, and indeed accommodate multiple conceptions of nationalism and what it means to belong to a state. Of course, there are many scholars, both in India and overseas, who for some time had seen the federal system in India in practice as being, in some ways, an exemplar of a kind of model of federalism that has, over time, successfully enabled different identities to coexist. So that, for a long time, there, and especially in the era of political regionalization from, the late 1980s to 2014, that there hadn't been an essential tension between an Indian identity and a Tamil identity or a Bengali identity or a Punjabi identity, whatever it was, that those regional national identities could be held as complementary rather than contradictory. So I think it's worth kind of challenging the idea that there is necessarily a tension between nationalism and federalism. That federalism is actually a kind of a form of political institution, an idea that can, in theory, accommodate multiple conceptions of nationhood. So that's the kind of a first point. The second point that I wanted to make is, in some ways, I think the big dilemma that we see at present is as much a question about what happens to the practice of federalism when there is a dominant party in power at the centre. This isn't the first time that dilemma has presented itself. Of course, the period of Congress dominance under Indira Gandhi also threw up similar challenges to state autonomy to the present moment. But I think it's worth reflecting a little on the vulnerability, if you like, of the idea of federalism in India to changes in the party system, and what happens to federalism when a single party has a majority in Parliament. As we've heard from the previous speaker, there is a long tradition of centralism in India's constitutional thought, both in the colonial era and in the design of the Constituent Assembly. And I'm inclined to agree with the suggestion that if it wasn't for partition, I think India's constitutional architects would have found another reason to revert to the kind of vision of a centralized schema of federalism that had been present in debates within the Congress Party, in the Nehru Report, and in other strands of nationalist thinking pre-independence. So, the Constituent Assembly deliberately adopted by design a centralized scheme of federalism, one that moved away from the kind of separate spheres approach to federalism, the idea that two levels of government should have sacrosanct autonomy in their relative spheres, the kind of idea of federalism that had been found in the example of the United States, for instance, until the mid-20th century. India's constitutional architects very deliberately moved away from that kind of separate spheres approach towards a much more centralist model, in which the centre, in theory, has quite extraordinary powers of intervention in even those matters that are constitutionally reserved for the states. So I think it's no surprise that the actual practice of federalism and the degree of autonomy that states experience is intimately shaped by the structure of political power and the fortunes of political parties, and in particular the balance of political power held by national and regional parties has to a large extent shaped the actual functioning of Indian federalism. And I think it's useful to remember that in the period between, from the late 1980s and early 1990s, in the context of economic liberalization as well, there were very confident predictions by many scholars in India and internationally that India was somehow kind of moving on an inexorable path towards greater federalization, that the states had comfortably found a strong degree of political and economic autonomy, and that it was very unlikely that things would change. Of course, then the 2014 Lok Sabha elections did shake up that trajectory, and we see that the return of a dominant party means that there's nothing like an execrable path towards greater federalization. The kind of question that arises for me, though, in that given that, is why in that era of greater of the kind of move towards federalization and the greater role of regional parties and and in national coalition governments in Delhi, why wasn't more done in that era of regionalization to strengthen the institutions of federalism? It seems to me that the legacy of that period of political regionalization hasn't actually been one that left a very strong legacy in terms of strengthening federalism as an institution. I think, for example, of the fact that one of the key recommendations of the Sarkaria Commission, which was the establishment of the Interstate Council, the Interstate Council basically fell into abeyance in the 2000s. It met, after 2006, it didn't meet again for another decade. And those kinds of institutional structures need to be embedded and become routinized in order for there to be spaces that are resilient in the face of changes in the party system. So I think just to wrap up here, I suppose I'm keen to kind of suggest that there's a role for regional parties, and I'd include the DMK here, in thinking not only about federalism as state autonomy and an argument about decentralization, but also that regional parties have a role to play in thinking about the wider institutional structures that strengthen and embed federalism. And that includes not only state autonomy, but thinking about the spaces for negotiation and collaboration and information sharing across levels of government, whether that's vertically between central government, union government, states and local bodies, or horizontally across states. That are a fully engaged debate about the future of federalism needs to think not only about state autonomy, but about those other institutional structures which have come under a lot of pressure, have also been in a good degree of flux since 2014, the abolition of the Planning Commission, the establishment of the GST Council, and so on. So I think that my plea would be, yes, a discussion about decentralisation and autonomy, but also about those other institutional aspects of federalism, which are really important too.